In the spring of 1990, Samuel Noah Kramer sat in his study at the University of Pennsylvania, surrounded by photographs, notebooks, and reproductions of ancient clay tablets covered in cuneiform script. He was 93 years old. For over 60 years, he had been the world's foremost authority on Sumerian civilization, the scholar who had translated more Sumerian texts than anyone in history, who had written the definitive works on the world's first civilization, who had shaped how generations of academics and the general public understood humanity's earliest chapter. But according to colleagues who visited him during those final months, Kramer was not reminiscing about his achievements or reflecting with satisfaction on a career that had transformed ancient Near Eastern studies. He was troubled, agitated, obsessed with a growing conviction that something fundamental had been missed, that he and every other Sumerian scholar had been reading the texts correctly while understanding them completely wrong. Kramer died in November 1990. The obituaries celebrated his monumental contributions to archaeology and linguistics. Academic journals published tributes honoring his translation work and his role in bringing Sumerian civilization to modern awareness. His books remained required reading for anyone studying ancient Mesopotamia, but virtually no one mentioned the warnings Kramer had been trying to communicate in his final years. The unsettling possibility that modern minds, no matter how carefully they translated ancient words, might be fundamentally incapable of understanding how Sumerians actually thought, what their texts actually meant, or what their civilization truly represented. This is the story of what the world's top Sumerian expert realized at the end of his life, why he believed we had misunderstood everything about the first civilization, and how his final warnings suggest that human history, consciousness, and potential are far stranger than anything academic archaeology has been willing to acknowledge. Samuel Noah Kramer was born in 1897 in Ukraine and emigrated to the United States as a child. He studied ancient languages and Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania, receiving his doctorate in 1929. At that time, Sumerian studies were still in their infancy. The civilization had been unknown to modern scholarship until the mid-19th century, when excavations in Mesopotamia began uncovering cuneiform tablets written in a language that was not Akkadian, Babylonian, or any other known ancient tongue. Scholars gradually recognized they were dealing with a completely separate language and culture that predated the Babylonians and Assyrians. This earlier civilization had occupied southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, from approximately 4,500 BCE to 1900 BCE. They called their land Sumer, and their language was Sumerian, a linguistic isolate with no known relationship to any other language family. By the time Kramer began his career, the basic outlines of Sumerian civilization were known, but the vast majority of recovered tablets remained untranslated. Thousands of clay fragments sat in museum storage rooms, covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform impressions that no one could fully read. The language was dead. There were no native speakers, no living tradition, no Rosetta Stone providing direct translation keys. Kramer dedicated his life to cracking this linguistic code. He worked in museum collections across Europe and America, photographing tablets, comparing texts, identifying patterns, building vocabularies, and slowly piecing together grammar and meaning from fragmentary evidence. His methodology was painstaking, comparing how specific signs appeared in different contexts, identifying recurring phrases, and finding parallel passages that shed light on obscure terms. Over 6 decades, Kramer translated more Sumerian literature than all previous scholars combined. He worked on epic poetry, religious hymns, royal inscriptions, administrative documents, mathematical texts, legal codes, medical prescriptions, agricultural manuals, and scholarly commentaries. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced general audiences to Sumerian achievements, arguing that dozens of cultural innovations, including writing systems, legal codes, and literature, originated in Sumer before appearing in other civilizations. Kramer became the authoritative voice on Sumerian civilization. When museums, universities, or media wanted expert commentary on ancient Mesopotamia, they turned to Kramer. His translations were cited in countless academic papers. His interpretations shaped textbooks. His framework for understanding Sumerian culture became the standard model that other scholars built upon. And that's precisely what began troubling him in his later years, the realization that this entire edifice of interpretation might be built on a fundamental category error that made translation accurate but understanding impossible. Sumer matters to human history because it represents, according to conventional archaeology, humanity's first civilization. The Sumerians developed the earliest known writing system around 3400 BCE. They built the first cities with populations in the tens of thousands. They created the first complex bureaucracies with specialized administrators, record-keeping systems, and hierarchical organization. The list of Sumerian firsts is staggering. The earliest schools were Sumerian institutions, training scribes in cuneiform writing. The earliest known legal codes, predating Hammurabi, were Sumerian. The earliest literature, including flood myths and hero epics, came from Sumer. The wheel, the plow, irrigation systems, bronze metallurgy, astronomical observations, mathematical notation, medicinal recipes, and architectural innovations all appear first in the Sumerian archaeological record. This made Sumer the foundation of human civilization, as conventionally understood. Egypt, Mesopotamian successor states, the Indus Valley, and ancient China all developed writing, cities, and complex societies after Sumer pioneered these innovations. Understanding Sumer meant understanding the origins of civilization itself. Kramer's work documented these achievements comprehensively. His translations revealed Sumerian poetry, mythology, and thought in unprecedented detail. He showed that Sumerians were not crude primitives, but sophisticated thinkers with complex cosmologies, ethical systems, and cultural achievements. But there was always something that bothered careful readers of Kramer's work, even if they could not quite articulate what. In his earlier publications, Kramer wrote with confidence about what Sumerians believed, how they thought, and what their texts meant. In later works, footnotes and qualifying statements began appearing more frequently. Passages that earlier had seemed straightforward were revisited with more cautious language. Kramer began admitting uncertainty about precise meanings, and he noted that certain concepts might not translate cleanly into modern categories. Colleagues who worked with Kramer in the 1970s and 1980s noticed he was returning obsessively to tablets he had translated decades earlier, questioning his own interpretations, and expressing frustration that something essential was being missed, even when individual words were being translated correctly. The problem Kramer identified was not about vocabulary, it was about fundamental categories of thought. Modern people, including modern scholars, assume that ancient people thought essentially like we do, just with different knowledge and beliefs. We assume they distinguished between natural and supernatural, between history and myth, between literal and metaphorical, between religious and secular, and between subjective and objective. We assume ancient people used terms such as God, world, human, creation, and time to refer to concepts roughly equivalent to what we mean by those words. When we translate a Sumerian word as God, we assume it refers to something like what modern religious people mean by God, a supernatural being with agency, personality, and power over nature. But what if Sumerians did not think in these categories at all? What if their language encoded a completely different organization of reality, where our distinctions between natural and supernatural, inner and outer, temporal and eternal, and sacred and profane simply did not exist or existed in radically different forms? This was the possibility that haunted Kramer in his final years. He realized that you could translate every word correctly according to conventional understanding and still completely miss what the text was actually communicating because the entire conceptual framework was different. One example that troubled Kramer involved the Sumerian word often translated as God, Dingir. Conventionally, this is understood as referring to deities in the polytheistic Sumerian pantheon, including An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and others. The texts describe these gods creating the world, establishing civilization, interacting with humans, and determining destinies. Kramer began questioning whether Dingir actually referred to supernatural beings in the way modern religions conceive of gods. In certain contexts, the words seem to refer to principles, forces, or qualities rather than personalities. Sometimes it appeared to describe states or modes of awareness rather than external entities. He noted that Sumerian cosmology did not clearly separate gods from nature, humans from gods, or consciousness from cosmos in the ways modern thought assumes. The boundaries we take for granted as fundamental divisions of reality might not have existed in Sumerian understanding. This realization extended to how Sumerians organized their entire worldview. Modern people separate religion, politics, science, and psychology into distinct domains. We understand these as separate spheres that might interact but are fundamentally different categories. Sumerian texts do not appear to make these distinctions. What we would call religious ritual, political administration, astronomical observation, and psychological states all flow together in Sumerian writings without the categorical boundaries we impose. Kramer worried that by translating Sumerian texts using modern categories, scholars were distorting the original meaning in ways that made the texts readable to modern audiences, while rendering them fundamentally incomprehensible. The translations created the illusion of understanding while actually obscuring what Sumerians were trying to communicate. The Sumerian king list became a crucial example of this problem. This ancient document lists the kings who ruled Sumer from its mythical origins through historical periods. The early portions of the list give impossibly long reign lengths, rulers who supposedly governed for tens of thousands of years. Later portions list kings with plausible human lifespans, whose reigns can be correlated with archaeological evidence. The standard scholarly interpretation divides the text into mythological sections, the impossibly long reigns, and historical sections, the plausible reigns. This distinction treats early Sumerian rulers as legendary or symbolic figures, while later rulers are considered historical persons. But Kramer came to doubt this division. He questioned whether Sumerians used concepts of myth and history the way modern people do, as distinct categories separating fictional narratives from factual records. What if the king list was not trying to distinguish between mythical and historical periods, but was documenting something else entirely? What if the impossibly long reigns were not exaggerations or myths, but represented something real that we do not have categories to understand? Not literal chronological time, but perhaps different modes of temporal experience, different states of consciousness, or different frameworks of reality that existed before some fundamental shift occurred. This reinterpretation suggested that Sumerians might have experienced time, consciousness, and reality differently than modern humans do, not because they had different beliefs about these things, but because the actual structure of their awareness was different. The turning point in Kramer's thinking allegedly involved a specific tablet from Nippur, ancient Sumer's religious and cultural center. Kramer had translated this tablet early in his career, and his interpretation had become standard in Sumerian studies. The conventional reading described how the gods gifted civilization to humanity, teaching agriculture, writing, crafts, and governance to primitive humans who lived in chaos before divine instruction. This interpretation fit perfectly with modern assumptions about how civilization develops. Humans exist in primitive states until someone, whether gods, culture heroes, or innovative individuals, introduces the knowledges and the technologies that enable civilized life. Civilization is something given, taught, or invented, and then passed down through generations. But when Kramer revisited this tablet in his 80s, he became convinced his earlier interpretation was wrong. The Sumerian text was not describing civilization being given to humanity by external gods. It was describing civilization emerging through an awakening, a change in consciousness that allowed humans to remember, perceive, or access knowledge that had always been present but had not been accessible before. The difference is profound. In the conventional reading, humans are passive recipients of civilization taught by superior beings. In Kramer's reinterpretation, humans undergo a transformation that enables them to manifest capabilities that were latent or dormant. Civilization is not given from outside. It emerges from within through a change in how consciousness operates. This reinterpretation reframed what Sumerian gods might actually be. Rather than external supernatural beings who intervene in human affairs, the gods might represent principles of consciousness, modes of awareness, or organizing patterns of perception and cognition. When Sumerian texts describe Enki teaching humanity arts and crafts, they might not mean an external god instructing primitive humans. They might be describing the activation of a particular mode of consciousness, call it Enki consciousness, that allows humans to perceive patterns, relationships, and possibilities they could not access before. This would make Sumerian religion not about worshiping external beings, but about cultivating, accessing, and organizing different states of awareness. Temples would not be houses for gods who live elsewhere. They would be technologies for inducing specific consciousness states. Rituals would not be requests for divine favor. They would be techniques for shifting awareness and perception. If this interpretation is correct, then virtually everything modern scholarship says about Sumerian religion, cosmology, and culture would be based on a fundamental misunderstanding. We would be reading their texts through completely inappropriate categories, like trying to understand quantum mechanics using only medieval alchemy concepts. When Kramer began sharing these revised interpretations with colleagues in the 1980s, the response was almost uniformly negative. Other Sumerian scholars rejected his new readings, arguing that he was abandoning rigorous philology for speculative philosophy. They insisted his original translations were correct, and that his later doubts reflected the wanderings of an aging mind rather than genuine insight. Academic conferences where Kramer presented his concerns reportedly became contentious. Younger scholars who had built careers on the framework Kramer established were hostile to suggestions that the entire foundation might be misconceived. Journal editors rejected papers incorporating his revised interpretations, demanding he return to conventional readings. The resistance was not just academic conservatism. Accepting Kramer's late-life conclusions would mean acknowledging that decades of Sumerian scholarship had been systematically misinterpreting the texts. It would require rethinking not just specific translations, but the entire conceptual apparatus used to make sense of Sumerian civilization. Most scholars were not willing to consider that possibility. It was easier to dismiss Kramer's concerns as the eccentricities of an elderly academic than to confront the implications of what he was suggesting. Kramer's reinterpretation extended to how we understand Sumerian achievements in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and governance. Conventional scholarship attributes these accomplishments to gradual cultural evolution. Sumerians developed agricultural surpluses that supported specialists who had time to develop writing, calculation, and other skills. But if Sumerian consciousness operated differently than modern consciousness, their achievements might not reflect gradual development of the same cognitive capacities we possess. They might represent capabilities that emerge from fundamentally different modes of awareness. Their mathematical and astronomical knowledge, for instance, might not come primarily from observation and calculation as modern science does, but from direct perception of patterns and relationships that are not visible to consciousness structured the way ours is. Their engineering might not rely on trial and error experimentation, but on intuitive understanding of forces, materials, and geometries accessed through non-ordinary states of awareness. This would explain certain anomalies in Sumerian culture that have always puzzled scholars. How did Sumerian mathematics and astronomy achieve such sophistication so quickly? Why do their earliest texts seem as sophisticated as later ones, rather than showing progressive development? How did they develop complex irrigation systems and monumental architecture without leaving evidence of the experimental failures we would expect from trial and error learning? If Sumerian consciousness had access to knowledge through modes unavailable to modern consciousness, their achievements would not require the long developmental timelines conventional scholarship assumes. One of the most disturbing aspects of Kramer's late-life interpretation involves Sumer's decline and collapse. Conventionally, Sumer fell due to political and environmental factors, invasions by Akkadians and other groups, environmental degradation from intensive agriculture, and the rise of competing power centers. But Kramer proposed something more troubling. He suggested that later Sumerian texts show signs of cognitive decline, that later Sumerians no longer fully understood their own earlier traditions and were gradually losing access to the modes of consciousness that had enabled their civilization's original achievements. The later texts are more concrete, more literal, and more focused on mundane administrative details. The cosmic awareness evident in early Sumerian literature diminishes. The gods become more anthropomorphic and less like principles of consciousness. Religious practice becomes more ritualistic and less transformative. Kramer interpreted this pattern as evidence that Sumer did not just politically collapse, it underwent a collapse of consciousness. The later Sumerians were biologically the same people as earlier generations. living in the same cities and reading the same texts. But they were reading those texts the way modern scholars do, translating words correctly while missing the experiential reality the words pointed toward. This cognitive decline would explain why Sumerian civilization could not perpetuate itself despite having writing, institutions, and accumulated knowledge. If the civilization's achievements depended on specific consciousness states that were fading, the civilization would decline even as the superficial markers of culture persisted. Civilization, in this view, is not simply an accumulating set of tools and institutions. It is a fragile state that requires active maintenance of particular capacities of awareness. The implication is chilling. If consciousness can decline, if humans can lose access to modes of awareness they once possessed, then civilization is not a guaranteed upward trajectory. It can unravel when the inner conditions that sustain it erode. When Kramer died in 1990, his obituaries and tributes focused on his early and mid-career achievements. They celebrated his translations, his scholarship, and his role in bringing Sumerian civilization to academic and public attention. His books remain standard references, and his influence on the field was undisputed. But his late-life warnings about fundamental misunderstanding were quietly ignored. The academic establishment preserved the model of Sumerian civilization that Kramer had built in his prime while sidelining the concerns he developed through 6 decades of deeper engagement with the material. Current Sumerian studies proceed largely as if Kramer's final doubts never existed. Translations continue using the same categories and assumptions he questioned. Sumer is still presented as humanity's first civilization that invented writing, cities, and complex society through conventional cultural evolution. The possibility that Sumerian consciousness operated in fundamentally different ways than modern consciousness, that their texts encode experiences and knowledge inaccessible to modern categories of thought, and that their civilization's rise and fall might represent something far stranger than political history, remain at the margins of academic discourse. These ideas are often dismissed as speculation, despite coming from the scholar who understood Sumerian texts better than anyone in modern times. The suppression is not active censorship. It is something more subtle, a collective decision by the academic establishment to ignore the parts of Kramer's legacy that threaten comfortable frameworks and to preserve only the parts that fit within conventional understanding. If Kramer was right, if Sumerian civilization has been fundamentally misunderstood because modern minds impose inappropriate categories on ancient texts, then the implications extend far beyond academic Sumerian studies. It means human consciousness might not be a constant. The way we experience reality, organize perception, and access knowledge might be historically contingent rather than universal. Humans in different eras or cultures might not just have different beliefs about reality, they might actually experience reality through different structures of awareness. It means civilization might not be what we think it is. If Sumerian achievements emerge from consciousness states we no longer access, then our model of civilization as accumulated knowledge and technology misses something essential. True civilization might require maintaining specific modes of awareness, and losing those modes means losing civilization, regardless of how much information is preserved in texts and artifacts. It means ancient texts might contain knowledge we can read but not understand, like someone who can sound out words in a foreign language without comprehending the meaning. We can translate Sumerian, Egyptian, Vedic, and other ancient texts into modern languages while completely missing what they are actually communicating because the experiential framework they reference no longer exists for us. Most disturbingly, it means we might be living through a continuation of the cognitive decline Kramer detected in later Sumerian texts. Modern consciousness may be even more limited than late Sumerian consciousness, and further removed from the awareness that characterized humanity's earliest civilizations. We pride ourselves on scientific progress and technological advancement, but if we have lost access to modes of consciousness that allow direct perception of patterns, principles, and relationships our ancestors accessed readily, then we are not progressing. We are specializing. We are becoming very good at manipulating the physical world through technology while becoming increasingly disconnected from other ways of knowing that were once available. Kramer's final warning was that we can translate ancient texts perfectly while understanding them not at all. We can excavate ancient cities, recover ancient artifacts, and reconstruct ancient chronologies while still missing what those civilizations actually were and what they actually knew. The world's top Sumerian expert spent 60 years building the modern understanding of humanity's first civilization. And at the end of his life, he tried to tell us we got everything wrong. Not the translations, but the interpretation, not the words, but the meaning, not the facts, but the framework. Before he died, he asked us to listen. He asked us to consider that Sumerian civilization might represent something far stranger than the conventional story of humanity's first cities and first writing. He asked us to recognize that ancient people might have experienced consciousness differently than we do. He asked us to acknowledge that civilization might be fragile and dependent on maintaining specific awareness states. Academic Sumerian studies did not listen. The framework Kramer questioned in his final years remains the foundation of how Sumer is taught and understood. His warnings were quietly ignored, dismissed as the confused concerns of an aging scholar, rather than the hard-won insights of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to understand an alien mind. But the clay tablets remain. The texts are still there, still readable, still holding whatever knowledge or awareness Sumerians encoded in cuneiform wedges 5,000 years ago. And if Kramer was right, we are reading those texts the way late Sumerians did, sounding out the words, following the syntax, translating the vocabulary, while missing entirely what they were meant to communicate. Civilization began at Sumer. That is what Kramer taught us. But what if Sumer itself was remembering something older, already trying to preserve knowledge from an earlier state? What if the texts we translate so confidently are instruction manuals for modes of consciousness we no longer possess, guides to awareness we can no longer access, records of experiences we can no longer have? The world's top Sumerian expert tried to warn us. Before he died, he told us we had been reading the texts wrong, not mistranslating, but misunderstanding, seeing the words, missing the meaning, building elaborate scholarly frameworks around ancient civilizations, while failing to grasp what made them civilization at all. We did not listen. We celebrated his achievements and ignored his warnings. We kept teaching Sumer the old way, kept translating texts the old way, kept assuming ancient people were just like us, only with older technology and stranger beliefs. And if Kramer was right, we are still doing it. Still reading texts we do not understand, still living in the ruins of consciousness we do not recognize, still congratulating ourselves on progress while losing access to awareness that our ancestors considered fundamental to being fully human. The clay tablets wait, the texts remain, and somewhere in those cuneiform impressions, the Sumerians encoded something we are not seeing, not because we cannot read the words, but because we cannot think the thoughts, experience the awareness, or access the modes of consciousness the words were meant to trigger. Noah Kramer knew this. At the end of his life, after 60 years of studying Sumerian more deeply than anyone else ever had, he tried to tell us. He asked us to listen. He warned us we had gotten everything wrong. We should have listened. Because if he was right about Sumer, then what else have we gotten wrong? What other ancient knowledge have we translated without understanding? What other civilizations have we excavated without grasping what they actually were? And most frightening of all, if consciousness can decline, if awareness can be lost, if we can become less than our ancestors even as our technology advances, then what are we losing right now that we do not even notice? What modes of perception are fading from human experience as we stare at screens and mistake information for knowledge, translation for understanding, and the ruins of ancient consciousness for primitive fumbling toward the enlightenment we believe we have achieved? The Sumerians tried to tell us something. Kramer spent his life trying to hear what they were saying. At the end, he realized he had been listening wrong the whole time. Before he died, he tried to warn us. Very few people listened. The clay tablets remain. The message is still there, and we are still not hearing it.